The day had begun like any other in the bustling city, known for its rich history and grand royal traditions. Tourists from all over the world flocked to this city to witness one of its most famous attractions, the royal guards. Dressed in their full ceremonial uniforms, these guards stood at attention in front of the grand palace, silent and motionless, as part of the tradition that had lasted for centuries. To visitors, it was a mesmerizing sight. The guards, stoic and unwavering, seemed almost like statues, symbols of a long-standing tradition that represented the nation's history and pride. Among the crowd of curious tourists, a young man from abroad stood, eager to experience everything the city had to offer. He had heard about the royal guards before, but standing there in front of them, he could hardly believe his eyes. He marveled at the discipline and poise of the soldiers, wondering how they managed to stay so still for so long. For him, it felt like an exciting moment to capture on his camera, a souvenir he would remember forever. As he watched the guards, the thought crossed his mind that he should do something playful, something memorable to mark the occasion. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, and he thought he could be the one to make a little fun out of the serious display in front of him. He stood there, looking at the guard closest to him, his mind racing. In a moment of impulsiveness, he reached out and slapped the back of the guard's uniform. It wasn't a violent gesture, just a light, harmless tap that he thought would amuse those around him. The moment the slap landed, a cold silence fell over the crowd. The young man immediately realized something was wrong. The guard didn't flinch or move. He remained as still as ever, but there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The tourists around him seemed uncomfortable, some of them even looking away in surprise. The young man was still processing what he had just done when he heard the stern voice of a police officer behind him. Before he could even react, the officer was at his side, asking him to step aside. Confused, the tourist tried to explain himself, laughing nervously, thinking it was all a misunderstanding. He hadn't meant to disrespect anyone. He was just caught up in the excitement of the moment, and in his mind, it seemed harmless. But the officer's serious expression showed that this was no small matter. The officer explained that what he had done was a direct insult to the royal guard, a sacred part of the country's traditions. Slapping a royal guard was not only disrespectful, but it was also against the law. The young man's stomach sank. He tried to apologize, explaining that he didn't know the severity of his actions. But the officers were unmoved, and soon, more people had gathered around, some even taking out their phones to capture the scene. It was clear that what he had done would not be forgotten easily. In that moment, the tourist began to understand that his playful act had turned into a serious situation. The tourist stood there, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. His heart raced as he watched the officers speaking quietly among themselves, perhaps deciding what to do next. The crowd that had once been excited and lively now seemed to tense up. A few people muttered under their breath, some shaking their heads, while others simply stared. The young man felt a wave of embarrassment and confusion wash over him. What had seemed like a harmless joke only moments ago now felt like a major mistake. He was told to follow the officers, and he did so hesitantly, his mind still struggling to grasp the seriousness of the situation. As they walked, he noticed that the streets, usually filled with cheerful chatter, seemed quieter now. It was as if the city itself had sensed the shift in the mood. The tourists who had been snapping photos of the guards just moments earlier now avoided eye contact with him. Some looked at him sympathetically, but others clearly felt he had overstepped a boundary. The young man's stomach twisted in knots, and a heavy silence hung in the air. He was no longer just another tourist exploring a new city. He was now the center of attention, and not in a way he had ever imagined. When they arrived at a nearby police station, the young man was ushered inside, where the officers led him into a small room. The gravity of the situation started to settle in as he looked around the sterile room, the walls seeming to close in around him. He was asked to sit down, and soon a few more officers entered. They didn't seem angry, but there was an undeniable sense of seriousness in their demeanor. He was asked to explain what had happened, and with a deep breath, he tried to offer an explanation. I didn't mean to offend anyone," he stammered, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know it was such a big deal. It was just a joke. I thought it would be funny, like some kind of tradition for tourists." The officers listened, their expressions unreadable. One of them asked if he had been drinking, or if he was under the influence of anything, but the tourist assured them that he had not. He was simply caught up in the excitement of the moment, something he was sure everyone had done at least once. The officers nodded, but their faces remained stern. As the minutes passed, the tourist's mind raced, thinking back to his home country, where gestures like the one he had made would have been dismissed with a laugh or a quick reprimand. But here, things were different. The country he was in had a deep respect for its royal traditions, and to insult a royal guard was considered a serious offense, no matter how innocent the intention might have been. The law, as it turned out, did not leave room for misunderstandings or innocent mistakes. The tourist's thoughts were interrupted when a senior officer entered the room. The man, older and more composed than the others, took a seat across from the tourist. He didn't immediately speak, but the weight of his presence made the young man feel even more uneasy. The officer's eyes remained focused on him as he began to explain the gravity of the offense. In this country, insulting a royal guard wasn't just a minor offense. It was seen as an insult to the monarchy itself, to the very heart of the nation's identity. The officer's tone was calm but firm, and the young man quickly realized that he was in serious trouble. This wasn't just about a slap on the back. This was about national pride and respect for traditions that had been upheld for generations. The tourist's mind raced, trying to process the information, but nothing seemed to make sense. How could a simple gesture have led him to such a point? As the senior officer continued to speak, the young man's sense of confusion deepened. The words he was hearing seemed distant, almost surreal. He had heard stories about how strict some countries could be with their laws, but he never imagined something so simple could lead to such serious consequences. The officer explained that the royal guards were not just soldiers. They represented the heart of the nation's identity, its long history, and its traditions. To insult a guard wasn't merely disrespecting a soldier. It was seen as a disrespect to the very culture that had shaped the country for centuries. The tourist sat in silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of the situation. His mind kept going back to the moment he had slapped the guard's back. It had been meant as a light-hearted gesture, an impulsive action that seemed harmless in his mind. But now, in this sterile room, he realized that what he had done had deep repercussions. The officer spoke of the strict laws that govern behavior around the royal family and its representatives. In many ways, these laws were part of the fabric that held the nation together, and the government took their enforcement very seriously. "Do you understand now?" the officer asked, his voice calm but carrying an air of finality. The young man nodded, his throat tight with nerves. He hadn't meant any harm, but it was becoming painfully clear that good intentions didn't always matter when it came to following the law. It wasn't just about the slap itself. It was about the lack of respect he had shown for something far bigger than himself. The officer made it clear that ignorance of the law wouldn't be an excuse, no matter where he came from or how unfamiliar he was with the local customs. With each passing minute, the young man felt more and more like a fish out of water. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of regret. He thought about his family back home, who would never understand what had happened, and the friends who had been so excited to hear about his trip. How could he explain this to them? How could he ever make them understand that he had made a mistake, one that would now follow him for years? After a long pause, the officer stood up and motioned for him to follow. They walked down the narrow hallway of the police station in silence. The young man's mind raced, and his heart pounded in his chest. What would happen next? Would he be sent home with a stern warning, or would this be something far more serious? The idea of being locked away in a foreign prison seemed so far-fetched when he had first arrived. But now, it was all too real. They entered another room, and the young man was asked to sit down once more. He could feel his palms sweating as the officer began to prepare the paperwork. There was a certain finality to the way the officer moved, as if the decision had already been made. The tourist was informed that he would be facing a serious charge, one that would not be dealt with lightly. There would be no immediate trial, but the severity of his offense would need to be considered. As the young man sat there, he thought back to the moment before the incident, when everything had seemed so simple. He had never imagined that a single action could have such a profound impact. He wished he could go back in time, change his decision, and erase the slap that had set everything into motion. But now, all he could do was wait. As the tourist sat in the cold, sterile room, the weight of his situation felt heavier with every passing second. He couldn't help but replay the events in his mind, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled out of control. In the back of his mind, he kept thinking that surely there must be some misunderstanding, that someone would step in and explain the mix-up. But no one had, and instead, he found himself in this unfamiliar world of laws and traditions he knew nothing about. His thoughts were interrupted when a local news station picked up the story, and suddenly, the young man's situation was being talked about far beyond the walls of the police station. Social media exploded with commentary, and what had been a single, impulsive act quickly turned into an international conversation. People from around the world debated the severity of the punishment. Some expressed outrage at what they considered an overly harsh sentence for a simple joke, while others defended the country's right to protect its traditions. The young man's face appeared on screens in every corner of the world, and he realized that his small mistake was now a matter of public scrutiny. From the very beginning, it had felt like an innocent mistake. He had no idea about the strict cultural norms in place, no understanding of how deeply the royal guards were revered. In his home country, such an action would likely have been laughed off, dismissed as a silly, light-hearted mistake. But here, it was an insult to everything the people held dear. The young man, in his ignorance, had become a symbol of disrespect, a symbol he had never intended to be. As news outlets continued to cover the story, it became clear that the incident had sparked a larger debate about cultural differences and how tourists should behave in foreign countries. Some argued that visitors should take the time to learn about the customs of the places they visit, while others believed the punishment was disproportionate for a tourist who had acted without malice. The young man's home country, concerned by the unfolding events, began to make diplomatic efforts to negotiate on his behalf. Embassy representatives contacted local authorities, hoping to convince them to reduce the severity of the punishment. The young man, still in the holding room, was unaware of the growing international efforts to free him. All he could think about was the sentence that was looming over him. Meanwhile, his family back home was in complete shock. His parents, who had never imagined that their son's vacation would take such a turn, struggled to understand how something so minor could have such major consequences. His friends, who had been following his trip through social media updates, flooded him with messages of disbelief, urging him to stay strong. They couldn't believe that the young man, who had always been the life of the party, was now at the center of such a serious situation. They, too, couldn't fathom how a single mistake had escalated so quickly. The young man was still processing the gravity of the situation when he was called back to speak with the officer once more. His heart pounded as he stood up, unsure of what to expect next. Would they offer him a chance to explain himself again? Or was the decision final? He had heard rumors that there might be leniency, that perhaps the international attention would lead to a reduction in his sentence. But the officer's face remained as unreadable as ever. His palms were sweaty as he walked back to the interrogation room, each step feeling heavier than the last. All he could do now was wait, hoping that some miracle would turn things around, and he would leave the city as a wiser, though still free, tourist. The room felt colder than before as the young man waited for the officer to return. His thoughts were racing, and with every passing moment, his anxiety grew. He sat in the small, uncomfortable chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had never imagined that something so small, something so seemingly harmless, could cause such a storm. The idea that he might spend years in prison for a joke seemed unbelievable. Surely there was some mistake. Surely someone would step in and help him out of this mess. Minutes felt like hours as he sat there alone, his mind replaying every moment of the day. From the excitement of seeing the royal guards to the impulsive slap that had started everything, it was as if time had slipped away in the blink of an eye. He thought about his family back home, and how they would never understand what had happened. He thought about his friends, who would probably never believe how his simple holiday had turned into a nightmare. As the officer returned, the young man straightened up in his seat, hoping for some good news, some sign that things might take a turn for the better. The officer didn't say anything at first, but the way he entered the room told the young man that the situation was still very serious. There were no comforting words or reassurances. The officer simply sat down across from him and began explaining the next steps in the process. The young man was informed that the case had been reviewed, and that the seriousness of the offense was still being taken into account. The court would soon decide whether to follow through with the maximum sentence or to offer a more lenient punishment. The officer didn't sugarcoat the situation, but he also didn't say that all hope was lost. It was clear that the decision was still up in the air. However, he did make it clear that public pressure and international attention could have an impact on the outcome of the case. This was the first glimmer of hope the young man had received since the incident. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance. The growing international backlash against the severity of the sentence had caught the attention of many, including diplomats from his home country. He was told that the embassy had been in contact with local authorities, and they were actively working to negotiate a reduction in the punishment. The young man couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing that the eyes of the world were now on him. But he also knew that it wasn't over yet. He still had to face the court, and that's where everything would be decided. The officer advised the young man to remain calm and wait for further instructions. The legal process was slow, and he was likely going to be kept in custody for a little while longer. The young man nodded, trying to keep his composure. He was grateful for the small sliver of hope, but the uncertainty of it all was still overwhelming. His mind kept wandering back to that moment with the royal guard, the instant when he thought his playful gesture would be laughed off, and instead it had led him to this foreign holding room, facing the consequences of his actions. The officer's words echoed in his mind as he left the room. Public pressure, the international spotlight. Could they really make a difference? He wasn't sure, but he had to hold on to the belief that there was a way out of this. Maybe he would be given a second chance. Maybe he could return home, a little wiser, and with a story to tell. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that the next steps would be in his favor. The minutes stretched into hours, and as he sat in the cold room once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had forever changed in ways he could never have anticipated. The young man sat in his small, sterile room, anxiously waiting for news, his thoughts swirling around him like a whirlwind. It had been hours since the officer had left, and the silence was almost deafening. Every so often, he'd hear a distant sound, a footstep or a door closing, but it did little to distract him from the situation that seemed to grow more intense with each passing minute. He had no way of knowing what was happening outside these walls. Was there any progress on his case? Would the public outcry change anything? Or was he still stuck in the same place, waiting for a judgment that would drastically alter the course of his life? Despite the uncertainty, he tried to push the panic away and take deep, calming breaths. His mind kept racing back to that single moment, the slap. How could something so trivial have led to such a whirlwind of events? He hadn't meant to disrespect anyone, especially not the royal guards who had always been a symbol of respect and tradition in this country. But now, the reality of the situation was settling in, and the consequences of his actions seemed so much bigger than anything he could have imagined. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside his door. His heart skipped a beat, Was this the moment when they would come to tell him his fate? He had been told to remain calm, but the nerves were overwhelming. As the door swung open, the young man stood up, hoping for some sign of what would happen next. A different officer entered the room this time. This one was not the same one who had spoken to him earlier. The officer looked calm, professional, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor as he took a seat across from the young man. The tourist's heart raced as he tried to read the officer's face, searching for any hint of what was about to happen. The officer didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight to the point. "There has been a decision made," the officer said, his voice steady but serious. The young man's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either go terribly wrong, or perhaps be given a second chance. The officer continued, explaining that the legal system was taking the case seriously, but that after reviewing the situation, they had decided to take the international attention into account. The pressure from diplomats and the media had been enough to make the authorities reconsider the harshness of the sentence. Relief washed over the young man, but he knew better than to let his guard down completely. The officer was not giving him the all-clear just yet. The decision had been made, but it was not final. He would still need to appear in court to formally hear the ruling. The officer told him that, though the court might take the public's opinions into account, the final decision would still rest on the shoulders of the judges. However, the young man was assured that there was now a possibility for leniency. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was far better than the alternative, the full 5-year sentence that had originally been looming over him. The young man nodded slowly, processing the officer's words. He still couldn't fully believe what he was hearing. Was he truly going to get a second chance? Or was this just another delay, another piece of the process before he was sentenced to years of imprisonment? His emotions were a mix of cautious optimism and overwhelming uncertainty. He wasn't free yet, but this was the first glimmer of hope he had received since the whole ordeal began. The officer stood up to leave, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "You'll need to stay in custody for a little while longer," the officer said, "but at least now you know that things are moving in the right direction. We'll let you know when the court session is scheduled." As the door closed behind the officer, the young man sank back into the chair, his mind still reeling. There was a chance now, a real chance, that he might avoid the harshest of consequences. He would have to be patient a little longer, but this was the first time in days that he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little bit. It was still far from over, but for the first time since the slap, he allowed himself a breath of relief. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least now, the path ahead seemed a little less daunting. The young man spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty, caught between hope and fear. Each moment felt longer than the last as he sat in his small, quiet room, waiting for news. The officer's words about the possibility of leniency echoed in his mind, but there was still a sense of doubt that he couldn't shake. What if the court decided that his actions were too severe to be forgiven, even with the international attention? He tried to stay optimistic, but every time he thought about the trial, a knot formed in his stomach. His mind wandered back to his home country, imagining what his friends and family must be thinking, unable to understand the full weight of the situation. As the days passed, he began to notice the small details around him that he had previously overlooked. The cracks in the walls, the distant hum of the city beyond the holding room, and the coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. His thoughts often drifted to his family back home. How were they coping with the news? His parents had always been supportive, but this was something they had never prepared for. They had raised him to be respectful and kind, never imagining that a small gesture, meant to be playful, could lead to such serious consequences. Meanwhile, back home, the situation was evolving. News outlets continued to report on his case, with some emphasizing the need for cultural understanding, while others were still critical of the severity of the punishment. Social media was flooded with messages of support and concern, with people from all walks of life offering their opinions. Some rallied behind him, expressing that it was an unfortunate misunderstanding that should be forgiven, while others believed that no amount of international pressure should change the course of justice. The young man, still isolated in his holding room, tried to focus on the little things he could control. He kept telling himself that there was hope, that the public outcry and diplomatic efforts would make a difference. He tried to ignore the worry that gnawed at him, reminding himself that it wasn't over yet. There was still a chance that the judges would be lenient, still a chance that he would be able to leave this foreign country and return home to his life. When the day of the court hearing finally arrived, he felt a mix of dread and anticipation. It was the moment he had been dreading, but also the moment that would determine his fate. He was led into a courtroom, the air thick with tension. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of papers being shuffled and the occasional murmurs of the people around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat in the defendant's seat, looking at the faces of the judges and lawyers who would decide his future. The trial began, and the young man listened intently as the evidence was presented. His actions, while clearly impulsive, were laid out before the court. The defense made its case, highlighting that the young man had no ill intentions, that it was simply a moment of misjudgment, a mistake that had been blown out of proportion. The prosecutor, however, emphasized the seriousness of the offense, explaining how it was not just a slap to a guard, but an insult to the royal family and the traditions of the nation. The young man felt the weight of every word. He had hoped for understanding, for compassion, but the reality was that the stakes were high. He could feel the eyes of the court on him, and his anxiety grew as the trial continued. There were moments when he wanted to speak up, to explain his side of the story, but he knew better than to interrupt the process. His defense lawyer had prepared everything, and now all he could do was wait. By the time the court session came to an end, the young man was drained. His mind was foggy, and the room seemed to spin. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had given his best. He had been honest, and now it was in the hands of the judges. They would deliberate, and then they would make their decision. The young man's future lay in their hands. The hours following the end of the trial felt like an eternity. The young man sat in his holding room, his mind still reeling from the courtroom drama. He couldn't shake the images of the judges' faces, the arguments, and the words that had been exchanged. He kept replaying the trial in his mind, wondering if he had said enough, done enough to convince the court that he wasn't a criminal, that he was just a tourist who had made an unfortunate mistake. But there was no turning back now. He had done all he could, and now all he could do was wait for the final decision. Time seemed to stretch on as the minutes passed slowly. His thoughts wandered again to his family back home. What were they doing right now? Were they watching the trial unfold on television? Were they hoping for good news, just like he was? The young man could almost feel the weight of their hopes and fears from thousands of miles away. They must be so worried, he thought. They probably couldn't understand why this had happened. A simple mistake, a harmless action, turned into a nightmare that had consumed his entire life. He found himself pacing the small room, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and worry. He had no idea when the court would make its decision. He could only assume that the judges were deliberating carefully, weighing all the factors in the case. He hoped that they could see his side, that they would understand that he had never meant any harm, that he had been ignorant of the customs and traditions of this country. He wasn't a troublemaker. He was just a tourist who had made a mistake in a place he didn't fully understand. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door to his holding room opened, and an officer entered, his face unreadable. The young man's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and hoping for all at once. The officer motioned for him to follow, and without a word, the young man stood up, his legs shaky as he made his way out of the room. They walked through the narrow hallways of the station, the young man's anxiety building with each step. His thoughts raced. Was he about to be taken to a prison cell? Was the sentence going to be 5 years, just like they had originally threatened? Or had the court shown him mercy, taking into account the international attention and his lack of ill intent. When they finally reached the courtroom, the young man was led to his seat. The judges were already seated, and there was a sense of finality in the air. Everyone's eyes were on him, but he could barely bring himself to meet their gaze. His palms were sweaty, and his heart thudded in his chest as he waited for the announcement. The lead judge cleared his throat and spoke in a calm but firm voice. The young man held his breath as the judge began to explain the court's decision. The judges had carefully considered the case, and after reviewing the circumstances, they had come to a conclusion. It was clear that the young man had not acted with malicious intent, and the court recognized that he had made a grave mistake due to his ignorance of local customs. The sentence was not as severe as originally feared. The judge announced that the young man would be required to pay a fine and would be given a probationary period, during which he would have to prove his understanding of the country's laws and culture. The judge made it clear that this was a rare decision, one that took into account both the severity of the offense and the young man's lack of awareness. The relief that washed over the young man was almost overwhelming. He had been prepared for the worst, but instead, he was given a chance to make things right. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was far better than the 5 years in prison he had feared. The young man barely registered the rest of the proceedings as the judge's words sank in. He was free. He was going to be given the chance to go home, to learn from his mistake, and to move forward with his life. As he left the courtroom, the young man couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, one that he knew he would not take for granted. He knew he would have to work hard to rebuild his reputation and to prove that he had learned from this experience. But for now, he was simply thankful to be able to walk out of that courtroom, his future still in his own hands.